Around the time I came back from New York, my great uncle Llewellyn, we called him Uncle Lou, began visiting our house on Saturday nights, bringing a box of sugar wafers and a bag of peanut brittle. He owned the Ada Clare Candy Company, named for his wife, a plump lady, quite bejeweled, with numerous jangly bracelets on her wrists, who spoke not a word all evening as Lou talked about his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather David Powell, and I lay silent and still on the floor at his feet. David's father-in-law, William Cox, was a British seaman aboard a British warship who suffered miserably as all lowly seamen did. Living in dank quarters below decks, fed garbage, whipped with a cat o' nine tails for minor infractions, and when the first mate yelled, "All hands aloft!" the seamen scrambled up the rigging even in a storm, lest they be stripped naked and whipped for insubordination. But one day in harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, William was fastening rat guards to the lines holding the ship to dock when the second mate's attention was diverted by a fine young woman with a parasol approaching the gangway to visit the captain. And William saw his chance and slipped up the street past tobacco and sugar warehouses and broke into a run, knowing that if caught, he'd go straight to the gallows. He hopped aboard a horse-drawn wagon train and buried himself in a load of potatoes and was suddenly free of his old life. He escaped detection, made his way to Pennsylvania, and met Elizabeth Emily Boggs and married her. His daughter, Martha Ann, married David Powell, a Pennsylvania farmer, a restless man who felt the pull of the Golden West. And every few years, though he had good crops of oats and corn and timothy, he sold his farm and packed the babies in the wagon, a milk cow tied to the tailgate, and migrated westward, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, while bearing 8 children. 3 others died and were buried along the way. It was a saga of enterprise and independence, putting misery behind you and reaching for a brighter tomorrow, very different from the dutiful Denhams and cautious Keelers who accepted hardship as the Lord's will and awaited deliverance by the rapture. In 1859, David left his family in the care of his 3 eldest sons and headed for Colorado in the gold rush, passed through Cheyenne territory and traded with them, hunted antelope to feed his party, tried to cross the Missouri at flood tide, 8 wagons lashed together, but his wagon tipped over and a bag of sugar fell overboard and turned to molasses. He wrote Martha Ann, quote, "Hard rain and windstorm, cattle stampede, and we had to be on horseback all night. Awful night. Men all tired and want to leave. Horses all gave out and men refused to do anything. Wet all night, worked all day hard in the river trying to make the cattle swim and did not get one over. Had to turn back sick and discouraged. Have not got the blues, but am in a hell of a fix," end of quote. I adored this story. I whispered the words "hell of a fix" to myself. David got to Denver, found no gold claims available, served a term in the territorial legislature, returned to Iowa, and Martha Ann, who had waited 4 years for him, he begged her to come west with him, and she put her foot down. He tried to charm her into heading west, and a few months later she was pregnant with her 12th child, Edgar Alonzo. In 1864 they went west to Missouri. She dispatched her older boys, including my great-grandfather James Wesley Powell, to head east and collect the remains of the 3 children who had died en route and bring them back for burial in Missouri. And then David got it in his head to settle in Oklahoma. He made a claim near Hennessy, built a house and stable, dug a well, and one day he sat down under a tree, leaned against it, and died of a heart attack, an extraordinary ancestor, a farmer who'd kept on the move his whole life. His granddaughters were my grandmother Dora and her twin sister Della, who came north to Minnesota and became the first female railroad telegraphers in the U.S. Identical twins who operated as one, sharing the same uniform in Anoka. They had learned Morse code so they could give each other answers to questions in class. Dora took up teaching at a country school, and at the end of the term, the farmer from across the road, he was on the school board, came over to help clean the blackboards, and then he tried to kiss her. She said, "I ran away, but not so fast that he couldn't catch me if he tried." Which he did, and so the deal was sealed. She liked him because she could hear him singing in the fields as he plowed or mowed hay. He had a lovely tenor voice, and he had a mind for memorization and liked to quote poetry at length. That evening he hitched up the horses and they drove to town and were married and returned home. He was 20 years older than she, but he carried her into the house and up the stairs, leaving the horses hitched to the wagon, the reins hanging on the ground. He was not a good farmer, but he was a cheerful man, and they raised 7 children. I loved these stories dearly, William Cox jumping ship and David Powell pursuing a dream, though a farmer and the father of a big family who named his 5th child Isaac Newton and his 6th Harriet Beecher, a man of large aspirations. There was no scripture message whatsoever in the stories, only the lesson that you should follow your heart, take to the road, find your fortune or not, but not be bound by propriety. This story was told as I lay perfectly still on the floor, hanging on every word, always on Saturday night. Sometimes Aunt Ruth was there, correcting Uncle Lou, arguing about the details. I had many questions, but dared not interrupt, and now it's too late. My last aunt, Eleanor, died in 1996, and I grieve for the lost knowledge that she took with her. Except for Lou, my uncles didn't tell stories. They talked about cars and work and plumbing and, of course, about scripture, but never reminisced. They claimed to know nothing about family history. I was dumbfounded. How could you live your life and not remember it? Of course they remembered, but they were leery of venturing into those precincts of the past. I believe they were afraid of the feelings it might arouse. Aunt Ina told how she'd gone to a car dealer in Minneapolis in 1928, and though she'd never driven a car, she bought one, and she and 2 girlfriends drove on country roads all the way to Yellowstone Park to see the geysers, and then sold the car and took the train back to Minnesota to resume a circumspect life. Aunt Ruth told how Grandpa woke his children on a winter night and bundled them up and took them into the woods to see a silver timber wolf who was baying at the moon. Aunt Jo told about sitting in the schoolhouse during her math problems, and a girl said, "Look, your house is on fire," and Jo looked and it was. Mother said that when she was 13, she and Elise were doing dishes in the kitchen on Longfellow, and they got to laughing so hard that Mother knocked 2 of her sister Ruby's pies off the windowsill where they were cooling. She said, "And that was when I learned how to bake a pie, 2 of them in half an hour." The stories I cherished were the ones with no clear moral. The sailor jumping ship, the wayfaring farmer, Dora and Della using Morse code to share answers in class. And now I'm older than Lou was, and I buy peanut brittle to remind me of those Saturday nights, the quavery voice of the storyteller, me lying on the floor, my face next to his black leather high-top shoes, not moving a muscle for fear the story would stop and I would miss the messages from the past. Even as a child, I knew my family believed in keeping secrets secret. They were not gossips. The scandal of my parents' marriage was tightly guarded by dozens of witnesses for 70 years. An aunt had been abandoned by her husband, who ran off with a school teacher, leaving 3 children behind. I asked my mother about it, and she would say just so much and no more. I heard whispers about a brethren man who was teasing his sister's fiancé about shotgun weddings, and he grabbed a shotgun, not knowing it was loaded, and pulled the trigger and killed his future brother-in-law. He was the father of an aunt who married into the family. I knew these people. I could have asked, but the darkness was so deep. I feared I could be banished for asking. I still want to know this story, and I know it's too late. I believe it is not a story about evil, but about forgiveness and a decision made secretly and simultaneously by dozens of people to put the matter behind them and let the future be cheerful. I admire people who can do that. I need to know the story so I can honor them. I can't love someone without knowing them and walking a mile in their shoes.